Unbelievable pictures coming through over there. And it could be that Emmanuel Macron has underestimated the passion and the urgency of the people on the streets who want change. They're not very happy with the pension plan, and this is not happening in a vacuum. Let's discuss the strike. I'm joined now by Nabila Ramdani. She's a journalist specializing in French politics and not a stranger to the show. Nabila, good to have you back on the Newsmakers. Was this inevitable?
Well, Imran, thank you for having me again on the program. I think, people taking to the streets in France is, a national sport, if I may put it that way. Strikes in the public sector, and especially the railway networks happens, they happen every month. But this was a major strike because effectively it's an attempt to protect a special status for railway workers and public sector workers in general, in view of in the context of President Macron trying to reform the pension systems in France. And, as you said in your introductory segment, it was an absolutely major day of protest yesterday, and it not only paralyzed all sorts of transport systems, including international travels, such as the Eurostar and indeed flights, but it also threatened vital sectors in the public sector, from schools to hospitals.
Right.
Postal workers were involved, and also civil servants, from judges to rubbish collectors.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets yesterday.
And Nabila, I mean, you have these people, the rail workers, the teachers, the hospital staff, these people who have gone on strike. They believe that Macron is implementing a kind of Thatcheresque dismantling of the entire social welfare system. So they look at the pensions as just one aspect of it. Does it check out, or is France in need of reform, and maybe they're just protesting because, as you put it, it's a national sport?
Well, I think the strikes and indeed the major protests were aimed specifically at President Macron's pension reforms, but also generally at his attempt to cut on spending in the public sector in general. So protesters very much view Macron's reforms as an attempt to destroy the public sector in general, and that's why they were so angry about it, and they took to the streets in so many numbers. What effectively President Macron is trying to do is trying to simplify which is what is at the moment a very complicated and indeed cushy pension regimes. There are currently 42 pension schemes that are considered as the most generous in Europe, and if not in the world, especially for public sector workers. And what Mr. Macron is trying to do is trying to save money, basically, cut on public spending, not only on the pension systems, but also in the public sector in general. So, for example, at the moment, workers such as railway workers and indeed police officers, riot police officers, are benefiting from very generous pension systems and perks, and crucially can retire early, in the early 60s. So spending actually on public pensions in France represents 14% of the economy's output, and so that's a major chunk in the GDP. And what Macron is trying to do, I mean, there was an independent pension committee which forecast that the current system could run a deficit of 17 billion euros by 2025, which represents 0.7% of the GDP.
Nabila, for those who see this as a continuation of the Yellow Vests protests, because it's still under the same broad theme, are they accurate or not?
Well, there was a number of Yellow Vests who took part in the demonstrations as well, hundreds of thousands of them, in fact. They now tend to go out without the yellow vest because they can easily be identified, and so they tend to leave it at home these days. But I think the protesters are also inspired by the success of the Yellow Vests. Remember, they started their movement just a year ago through social media in the first instance, and then gathering en masse on the streets of Paris and across the country. And within a few days of them starting the movement, the government had already capitulated and scrapped the taxes on green taxes on fuel prices, which was at the center of their protests, and also basically gave away a package worth billions of euros to include a rise in the minimum wage, for example. So I very much believe that protesters would have that in mind, and they would be very much inspired by the early success of the Yellow Vests.
Well, whether it's about Macron trying to loosen up and make more flexible the labor market or impose more taxes, it's clear that a lot of French people are not happy about it, and they will continue to take to the streets. We'll be keeping a close eye on it. Nabila, come back on the show anytime. Good to have you on the program. Nabila Ramdani joining us there.